Uh, yeah, when I was in UC Bug, I feel like we didn't learn too much about set dressing, but then it wasn't until my internship that I realized that there's like a lot more that goes into it, and it really is like building the entire world. So it takes up a lot of space on the screen, and it is pretty important. Um, like especially in like storytelling. Yeah. I can go more into that, like if you guys have any more questions, but is there anything else?
What type, I guess your portfolio would definitely be helpful. What type of scenes have you set?
Mhm. Okay. Let me share. Oh,
We have, oh, you said it.
uh,
There we go. You should have permission now.
okay. Okay. This is my portfolio right now. It's not really tailored towards like the film and animation industry, but it's tailored more towards like freelance work right now. Um, so yeah, that's why I have like some music stuff, but I think I could go. This was like my CNM 190 short film that I did when I was a sophomore. And that was a really good experience, but not I didn't do much dressing on there. And I think this project is also like a good example of set dressing, but I took um 2D concept art and like made this 2D concept into 3D. But then yeah, that also involves like, being able to translate things from 2D to 3D and like understanding how it looks different in a drawing and then making that like look good in 3D, which involves like understanding the camera and stuff. So yeah, that is a simple example, but I think I can show more of like what I did at Pixar. This is part of the Pixar undergraduate program, which is like a 3-month program for what Pixar calls technical directors. That's usually not the term it's referred to in other companies, but usually technical directors in animation are usually people who are like really good at coding, and they're there to like support the art team by creating tools or software based on the needs of the production. At Pixar, however, technical director is more of like just anyone that works in 3D as opposed to like someone who does 2D concept art. So in the Pixar undergraduate program, you go through the entire Pixar 3D pipeline. So that includes layout, set dressing, modeling, shading, lighting, rigging, and effects. So as a quick overview, I could play my demo reel. This is just like the stuff that I worked on when I was in during this internship. So yeah, this was like my final project. At the end of the internship, you do an and sorry, this is our group project that we did at the end. So I did set dressing, and then we all had to help out with like modeling and shading certain assets. Um, yeah, we had about 2 weeks to just like create an environment or like come up with a little story and then tell that story through the environment. And I just included some shots that like highlighted a lot of the work that I did.
How do you, how are you like adding so many assets like at once? Like, I would assume like there has to be some procedural process here, or are you really just adding everything asset by asset?
So yeah, there is some procedural, for example, like this part there is someone um who was another intern that was really good at like Houdini, and at Pixar they call that set extension, which is like when you have to create a wider world, like if you're gonna create a whole city, that would go under the category of set extension, and it's usually procedural. So that was more like you create a kit kind of buildings or like pieces of buildings like walls, windows, roofs, doors, things like that. And then she was able to like create this fake city, and then we kind of like made it look like it was on a hill. Um,
I was more talking about like on the tables, there's like a lot of like food on the tables and whatnot, and like trash
Yeah,
there.
all this
Like,
stuff down here that's not including the city is just like hand dressed. So, um, yeah, I just like manually placed every single piece. Um, yeah, so there are like tools that they had built into Maya that were helpful. Like for example, if you just want something to be placed perfectly on a surface, it'll just snap to the surface if like you click on it, and you can kind of like just click and put a bunch of stuff around. Or you can just like scatter a bunch of things really quickly. So things like that were really helpful, but a lot of it was just more like me hand placing stuff and like actually really thinking about where it should go and like what would look good.
how do you like what's your process of like making something look natural?
Okay, wait. I can also go into this later. I made a couple slides where I can talk about it, but yeah, I think this project is a good example. Um, when it comes to like a messy or like chaotic scene like this one, um, first of all, like I start out large to big, so we started out with like proxy models and I just laid out the entire thing like it's all blocked out in like really simple models. Like for example, the buildings, which take up a lot of space, the carts, which take up a lot of space, their placement is important because it's like, what's the point of placing all these small assets on top of them if you're just going to end up moving it around later, or maybe it's not going to even be seen by the camera. So definitely like placing the overall components first is important, but then to make it look messy, I think usually it's like you add a lot and make it like super chaotic. So at first, like I had a lot more fruits or like more trash going on, but it wasn't necessarily like art directed or guided by anything. So then after that, you kind of like can pull back, and also it's always really helpful to get the feedback from other people. Um, yeah, I think I at this time I didn't know too much about like dressing, making a nice composition, but it was like important that we tried to lead the eye, like everything's trying to go up because at the end, like the moon is what's most important. So yeah, trying to keep attention away from like the edges by like making it dark and then kind of like adding things to frame the eye in that direction.
But you,
This was like one of the lighting exercises that we had, and this is like one of the characters from Turning Red. Um, and we had to like match the lighting from a scene that we liked in a movie. So I like the lighting from this scene in Chungking Express. So yeah, basically had to match this character to make it the lighting look accurate so it actually looks like she's embedded into the scene. This is like a shading and modeling project, and it's just, they all use like procedural shading. And this is a FX project with Houdini, and our this is like a rigging test. So yeah, that's it. I think kind of did a breakdown of the full group project. My individual project was also like set dressing and lighting, which is a lot of what I do now at work. Um, for this project, we could kind of pick to do whatever we wanted. Since we had already gone through the entire pipeline, a lot of people had parts of the pipeline that they were more drawn to than others, and I kind of knew that I liked modeling, dressing, and lighting. Um, so I picked some concept art that they had from Turning Red of a set of a character that didn't end up getting put into the movie. Um, so they had like a full drawing of like this apartment of one of the main character's cousins or aunt or something. Um, and I just like took that concept art and made it into an actual set. But yeah, it was a pretty rough concept art sketch. Like there wasn't that many details. It's not like I was like copying it one to one, but it was more like understanding the character and like trying to like how can you like describe the character without you actually having to know her, without you ever seeing her, just by looking at like this is where she lives, this is how she lives, and her character is supposed to be someone that's kind of like she's an artist, she's chaotic, she's kind of like an influence on the main character and tries to make her like in their original plan, it was like someone that inspires her to like be herself and like be a little bit more free-spirited. So yeah, that was like my goal with this project. It's just how can I tell that narratively without actually saying anything? So yeah, that is all I can show that I've like done professionally so far. I did another internship at Pixar after I graduated, and that was for set dressing and modeling, where I worked on Elio, which is going to come out later this year, and I did set dressing on like some of the space um, sets that they have, but I can't show it because it's not coming out yet. Um, and then I also did some modeling on a set for this movie Hoppers, I think is coming out next year. So yeah, I also can't show that. Um, yeah, right now I'm working at Steamroller. Let me see if I can show. Also made slides I can go through if this is helpful. But quickly, I'm working on this project right now at Steamroller where I'm doing set dressing and lighting of like this forest. This is like one shot that was just released in the teaser that they posted. So I can show this. And yeah, I think I use like a lot of the things I learned at Pixar at Steamroller, but it's definitely more stylized. It's kind of like a 2D look. So a lot of it is more minimal and kind of like graphic, trying to recreate like the look of a painting. Yeah. If you guys don't have any other questions like about my portfolio, I can go into the slides now, but let me know. Or if there's anything else that you guys want to see, I can talk about on my portfolio. Okay. So yeah, set dressing, which is what I know most about. This is kind of what I was covering earlier, which is like where I work rough to fine and lay out the biggest things first. So by architecture, I mean like buildings or, major structures that take up a lot of property. The ground is always like is actually super important, like being able to place where the ground is going to be. Are there going to be hills or like divots in the floor, things like that, because that has a big influence on animation and the characters and like where they're going to step, where everything's going to be placed. Like the ground has to be kind of set from the beginning. Or if it's yeah, like if you have big things like trees or mountains, if it's like a big, large organic set, all those things are really important to lay out first. Or if it's like an indoor scene, furniture is probably what is taking up the most space. So you would set like the walls, everything, and then the furniture. And at that stage is like when you would be defining the composition, um, and really like working around the character to make sure that the environment's not like drawing too much attention away from the main action or the character. Usually in like animation, it's not going to be a blank set. Like in the internship project I showed, there's usually going to be someone doing some sort of action. So it's really all about highlighting that and drawing the audience's eye towards that. And then after that, usually that would be when you would get feedback from like an art director or your team or whoever. And then depending on their feedback, you iterate based on that. And then maybe start to add like the smaller details, um, like really little assets, or like if it's an outdoor scene, like that's when you would add like the debris or the pebbles or like really tiny things. And then again, go back to your team and get more feedback and kind of like repeat that whole process again. hopefully you wouldn't have to be like redefining the entire composition, which is why we would try to get feedback from the start on that, and so that you don't have to like make major changes at the later stages. Yeah. These are some things that I personally think a lot about during dressing and like things that I learned from getting a lot of feedback from art directors in the past. Um, but like these are kind of rules, but it's not like you have to follow these rules. It's just that these are like what's usually standardized or like what I know I'm gonna get notes about. And so I'd rather think about it before I get feedback from anyone. So again, number one would be framing the characters. I feel like that's always the most important. And you're basically like you're implicitly telling the audience where to look without actually saying it. And a lot of that has to do with the environment and also lighting. So I feel like those things are pretty important together. Another thing is rhythm, which is just like kind of a rule in composition, which I'll talk about more. And variety, I think a lot of the times with CG, it's really easy to like duplicate things and everything kind of looks the same, or their assets are like, it's very obvious that you only made one model. A lot of the times you'll make like variants of the same object, so that you don't have what's called like twinning, where you have like the exact duplicate, unless it's that's what you're going for. Usually in the real world, nothing looks exactly the same. So you try to have different versions. Avoiding tangents, which is kind of like a rule that you often see in painting or like traditional art that I can also talk about more. And then setting the scale and the depth, understanding the size of your characters in, relative to the rest of the world. Like how big is this set? Is it a tiny room or are we like in an expansive space? That's all something that you get told via the environment. So, okay, this is such a low quality picture, but this is like a good example of composition and specifically like using like framing devices to show where the action is. So a lot of the times I feel like the edge of the frame, like you don't really want to put anything important there necessarily unless that's part of the layout with the animation, like the way the characters are placed. But when it comes to environment, these like you can usually put things that are closer to the foreground and on like the edge of the frame because that naturally creates like a vignette so that your characters stand out in the center. That's like one thing that I do a lot these days as Steamroller. Um, and yeah, I think it takes up a lot of space or like it is able to fill a lot of space on the screen so that your characters really shine. And this is kind of what I mean by rhythm. I feel like this is an example I would see a lot where it's like, for example, in Elio, there's a big forest, and it would be really easy to procedurally like place a bunch of trees that are like exactly perfectly spaced apart or all the trees are the same. But I think one important thing in composition is understanding rhythm and that like not everything, at least in the natural organic world, like a forest is not going to be like perfectly placed out unless it's a farm or something. So yeah, like when creating the forest in Elio, I thought at first that like, oh, I'm just placing trees. This should be pretty simple. But then surprisingly, I would get a lot of notes about things like that. And how do you make a forest look natural when you're hand placing it? Which means like not putting everything the same distance apart, putting some things closer to each other, creating depth by placing some layered and really far back away from the camera versus really far up close to the camera. Um, and also having like a different scales of the trees, things like that. This doesn't just apply to forests, that could just be anything like if you're placing rocks in a desert, rather than placing all the rocks in a perfect array. If you want to make it more natural, you have to think about creating balance and like where they're placed and like maybe clustering some rocks here and then maybe making a couple more in the background, not just like having it perfectly even. Um, this is an example of what I meant by like creating variants. I found this kind of like breakdown of what they did on Spider-Verse when creating the city. And I'm not sure exactly what they did, but I know that like for a lot of studios, when creating something like a city, it's not like they're individually modeling every single building in a unique way. But at the same time, not all the buildings look the same because that's not how real cities look. And it's more about you kind of create like a kit of buildings that all have their own variation. Like none of these here look the same, but they kind of have similar qualities. And I think just with like this set of buildings, you could probably create a whole city if you like strategically place them. And you wouldn't like place, for example, this one, two of them right next to each other when they look the exact same, because that would look pretty unnatural. So, but if you're able to like place this kind of sporadically and randomly throughout an entire city and you have different shading and like the lighting's in there, you wouldn't notice that's the exact same building, or you could like swap out a few elements, like maybe take away the fire escapes, something like that. So I think just with this, like you can create a lot of variation, which I think is important with any sort of asset where you know you're going to have a lot of them. All you really need is like two to three slightly different versions of them. And then you can dress those different versions around your scene, and just that itself will like make it look less CG and it'll make it look more natural. Yeah, this is another example. Like all these houses, in this case, it's not meant to be like a city, it's more like a suburb town where they kind of look similar, but all of them have like slight differences, and you could dress a whole street with just like replacing certain elements or just these houses themselves. This is what I mean by tangent line. I didn't really know what this was before. Like in math, like you know what, like you have a tangent against a curve, but a lot of times in art, they use tangents in this way where like if you have a line of anything, like the edges hitting each other, it creates like this tension and confusion sometimes in the image where you like don't understand where an object might end and another begins. I think in this context, like we know that these are lemons on a table, but like overall in a scene, that kind of like draws attention to itself. So a lot of the times, I think when getting feedback from art directors, it's like when they're really looking at the details, they're always looking for tangents and like how you can avoid two objects that are like kind of placed right against each other, or like creating this line of tension over here. This is usually how it would end up being fixed. So like for example, this would be called out as a tangent because the edge of this tree is perfectly aligning with the roof of the house. And then that it creates like it's a new form of its own rather than this being its own object, the tree, and then this being its own object as the house. And then this is kind of similar where they're not exactly in line, but like there is this space where they're like kind of sitting right against each other, and then that also just draws attention and it creates some tension there. So like one way to fix it is you just either overlap them, and like this says, it adds depth to it because then you can like see how far the tree is in comparison to the house. Or you could just not have it close together at all. Um, so yeah, I think that's something that gets called out a lot. Um, yeah, so I think this kind of I can talk about like how I'm using all of those elements or like thinking about them when dressing a scene like this. Like for example, adding things towards the edges, um, so that all the attention gets drawn to the characters, and also with lighting, it gets darkened on the edges. Um, and then a lot of this is creating depth because this is a pretty 2D looking scene, even though it's actually 3D. Um, it's a really important that we got like a sense that this forest goes further back than just where we're standing. Um, and a lot of that is like making sure, like if you looked at the scene in 3D from an overhead view, you would see that these trees are placed very, very far away from one another, further than it appears on the camera, and it's like really exaggerated so that we could get like a sense of depth here. Um, I'm also making sure like not to place the same models right next to each other or in the same size. So they didn't have that many variants of models for me to work with. So like this is the same as this, but it was just I had to change the scale, change the direction and the placement. Like here, and here, they're all the same model. Um, but yeah, just like placing them in different spots and also like creating like some balance between where they are in the screen. Um, yeah, like not putting them at the exact same angle right next to each other with the same scale, which would make it so obvious that they're the exact same thing. So yeah, that's like the same case for a lot of these objects sitting here. Yeah, I guess I talked about this too. This is one example where I had a mentor for the project who was a set dresser at Pixar. And when I first like submitted a like rough version of it, what I wasn't thinking about was like things like tangents. So I sent her like a screenshot of what I had, and then she went over and like drew and pointed out like everything that had tangents in it, and then told me like, okay, like could you shift that this way and just avoid anything where that occurs. Um, yeah, and this was also about like making it seem pretty chaotic and messy, but not being like too confusing. Yeah, I feel like I talked about this already, this too, but let me know if you guys have questions anytime. And then some notes, I guess, that could be helpful about like working in the industry that I didn't realize at the time is that you're working with a lot more people than you are in school. So with set dressing, the set dressing role specifically, you're working a lot with layout, and layout is kind of like they're kind of like the cinematographers that work with lighting as well, where they're placing the camera, moving the camera, deciding like how are the where the character is going to be, what's the framing of this shot, what angle are we looking at them from, um yeah, things like that, like where should the buildings be in the background. So layout team will have like I said, a big studio like Pixar, their layout team will have their own director of photography, and then the lighting team will have a director of photography. So usually you'll, if you're kind of like a lead with environments, then you'll be working with people like that, and like everyone's working together to make sure that the final shot looks really good. And then at least for someone like me who is like an intern doing set dressing or doing at Steamroller right now, I work all really closely with the art directors, and the production designer who's kind of like the person overseeing the entire film and what the overall look is going to be like. So yeah, you get a lot of feedback from them. And then modeling and set dressing go hand in hand. I think at a lot of studios, sometimes those are the same people. So I think if you're someone that likes modeling, then you might also be doing some set dressing in a role like that, or vice versa. If you like set dressing, usually it's important that you also know how to model because they might need you to make some assets sometimes. Um, and lastly, for like skills that I think they look for is usually having an artistic eye, which I think is kind of hard to qualify, but yeah, I think that goes to show like through showing your portfolio and having strong compositions, being able to talk through your work and explain the reason behind it. And also, I think sometimes having like a background in traditional art or like painting is helpful. And then another skill that I think stood out like when I was applying was like being able to translate 2D concept art to 3D scenes, because most of the time that's how you're working, where pre-production has like already created a lot of 2D concept art for you to go off of. And sometimes it's not going to be exactly how the final scene looks, but you need to be able to translate that overall look to the 3D scene. Like you might not have all the objects that are included in the concept, but you need to like be able to work around that so that, the overall style and vibe of the environment kind of comes over and to the final scene. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. That's all I have. So if you guys have any questions, I can answer them now.
So when you just start studying 3D animation or 3D modeling?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, yeah. When you just start like studying about 3D modeling or 3D animation?
Oh, when did I start
Yeah, yeah.
studying? Um, took UC Bug when I was a freshman at Berkeley. I did basic my first semester, and then I did advanced my second semester. And yeah, I feel like that was really like my introduction into 3D modeling and animation.
So you didn't touch any like a 3D modeling application like a Blender or Maya before taking UCPA?
Yeah, like I didn't know what it was at all before coming to Berkeley.
It's not.
Mhm.
Have you worked in any like video game work, like whether it's like freelance or anything, or are you mostly in animation and production?
Mm. I'm mostly in animation. Um, when I was at Berkeley, I did work with like the XR at Berkeley Club, and I did some environment work for one of the projects that they did, like in VR. And then on the side right now, I'm helping out with like at USC, they have a game design and development grad program, and those master's students need to have a thesis project. So right now, I just knew some people that had done that in the past, and I kind of wanted to learn more about games. So I'm doing like volunteer work with them where I'm like creating models. And yeah, I guess that's a little bit of a different process, like creating game ready assets for engine. Mhm.
Yeah, no, I mostly got into the class because I'm like big into video game development. And I feel like if you're trying to like set the scene for a video game, that, like having an artistic eye is kind of like what makes like a good video game. It's like just, you don't have to just think about, okay, like what assets like to put into the scene, but it's like, okay, like what game mechanics can I also like add that'll also like contribute to the scene, or also that like, that like because you're in this area, that it probably implies that you can do this thing, and it just helps the whole, well, yeah, I just think it's really interesting. And it helps me think about how to set up scenes and to think about it in a different way. Um,
Yeah, I don't know too much about the gaming industry, but I know that like it is a completely different process because in animation, it's like you're setting up the camera and it's completely still and you like know where it's gonna go and you know what's gonna be seen. But in games, the player has control and like even though there's boundaries to like what they can do, they can pretty much go anywhere and like see it from any angle that they want. So in that case, it's like even more important that the scene looks good from wherever you're standing,
yeah,
which is pretty tricky.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's funny you say that. I think like a good game that kind of like describes that. And if you want to look into it, a lot of people do like actual research on the game called Elden Ring. But essentially like the buildings in that game are some of like, if they were to scale, they'd be some of the largest buildings in the entire world. But when you're playing the video game, they don't seem that big. It's just for like, setting up the scene and framing like the whole like scale, gravity of the situation, things like that. But uh, yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious, like, are you mostly interested in going into games?
Uh,
Or like at all interested in film?
I think Pixar is really, really cool. I like game animation and like cartoon animations. Um, hey, if I can do both, I'll do both. I just think it's all really
Hmm.
cool.
No, I'm just curious, like,
Yeah,
what about everyone else? Like, what are you guys interested in? Are you, is this like more just for fun or like, are you interested in going into it as a career? If you know.
I'm actually making a video game actually about like it's I know you said earlier like okay like if you want to like make something messy like you start off with too much. I'm making a game about trash, and it's like if I add too much trash and it's like a video game, well it's like now we have like a I can't add too much trash where the game gets laggy. You know what I'm saying? Or like
Oh, yeah.
right, and it's like how can I make an environment with like stationary assets and also like assets that have physics that make the area look trashy but believable. Like, I don't know.
Yeah,
It's like,
that's
um,
interesting.
yeah. So I've actually been having a really hard time like setting up the scene and playing around with different assets and like figuring out what is, yeah, what's best for the scene essentially. And it's been a process.
Yeah, in that case, I think you have to just be like super strategic about where you're placing everything and like if you know where the player's gonna go, like how to just like keep assets in their eye line and like not have anything unnecessary that's like hidden behind things that they're not gonna see anyway. Or like once you incorporate lighting, if there's a lot of parts that are dark, then you don't need to put as many things there because it probably isn't gonna be seen anyway.
Very, very true. Yeah. Figuring out how to make something trashy. It's-
Yeah, I think, oh, I guess one thing I did forget to talk about is just like references and drawing a lot of inspiration from real life. Um, yeah, I think a lot of the times I was like encouraged to go out and like if I was stuck on something to actually like go out into the real world or like go on a walk at least to like clear your head. But like usually that would end up with me looking around and like noticing how things are and how like for example how trash might accumulate naturally on the street. Um, and like take pictures of things like that and kind of copy it.
it's complicated. The rules.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Just curious, what's your major in UC Berkeley?
I majored in art practice and then I minored in inks.
Wow.
Wow.
They
Yeah,
like
so
that.
for the minor.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know if they still have that. Probably. You can do a minor in inks.
I didn't let you do that. That's crazy. That's really cool. You-
Yeah, I kind of once I took UC Bug, I was like kind of sold on the idea of going into the industry. So um I was like, I really want to like combine my two interests. Um, I can't say that I like learned too much where I actually apply it in my work now, but I think having like a coding background is pretty helpful.
That's helpful for everything. I'm actually taking a drawing class for summer. So I'll be in the Berkeley Art Studio for summer. So
That'll be, I think any like learning anything related to art, especially like traditional art, is always somehow it is able to like carry itself into the 3D too.
everything is important. Just love learning, you know? Just, no, any more?
Does anyone have any more questions or things they want to get advice on? Well, I guess one thing that I was a bit concerned about is like a lot of the things you're talking about is like with the camera movements and like placing things based on what the camera can see. If you don't have the camera, say like finalized, like how would you go about that process? Or is it important to finalize the camera scenes and like the movement of the camera first before you start to dress the scene?
Mm, yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think you could kind of do like a basic layout of the set and then you would like it's kind of like scouting your location like how you would in real life like if you were to go find a building that you wanted to shoot at. Um so it's like it's kind of already in existence and then from there you can place your cameras in the scene and figure out what looks best. Um but I wouldn't go into like too much detail of like dressing and fully fleshing out the environment until you have your cameras finalized because it's so much easier to figure out like the framing of the shot if you have the camera set. Um, so yeah, I highly recommend like doing storyboards and then having your cameras reflect the storyboards. Um, and not really moving your cameras unless you think it's really important to the story.
Like working on any like independent projects, animations, passion projects. I'm big on indie projects.
Mm. Well, not for like my personal projects, but if you're big on indie projects, I have to shout out like Steamroller, which is where I work right now, since they're an indie animation studio, and they're doing like right now we're working on a new project, which is like this thing called Spice Frontier, and it's like its own original series. They're releasing the first episode on YouTube, and that's pretty cool to see like original animation coming out.
It's like your end goal with animation, or like you have like plans to make your own, you have your own studio or
Mm. I don't know what my end goal is right now. I think right now I'm pretty happy with like just making art, even if it's not like my original ideas. But I think in the future that would be cool. I'm also like pretty interested in maybe doing more freelance work, which is why I'm trying to like tailor my portfolio right now towards like freelance stuff so I can like maybe possibly do I kind of want to work with music. I think that would be cool, like visuals for music. Um so yeah, I'm trying to see if I can get any gigs like that.
yeah, no, I feel it. I forgot what I was gonna say now. I was gonna make a joke. I was like, you don't want an Emmy?
I don't know, like I don't know if I'm that ambitious. Like I feel like it would be cool to direct something, like maybe a short film. But
Yeah,
like right now, I don't know. I'm not really a writer or like into writing my own stories. I don't really have something that I want to tell right now, but that would be really cool. Yeah.
Would you have any advice to the students right now, with their UC bug short, and any words of encouragements?
Oh, yeah, I was gonna ask like, what are you guys working on? And if I could see anything, if you have stuff to show.
right now I'm working on like Reed's apology for my stupid alien, and it's taking a very long time. But the alien looks good though. But yeah, it's just work.
That sounds cool. Yeah.
I'm working on monitoring astronaut and spaceship and also try to ready astronaut, but I can't so struggle with reading now.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Both those things, read topology and rigging, are like I can't say much about it. It's just something that's tough and you kind of like learn through trial and error.
Yeah, or you find a tool that does it for you.
That's the best. I think I have some out there, but I don't know how good they are.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I said or,
Yeah.
and yeah, yeah, you can't really get around it. But yeah, that's kind of like why I took this class because I was doing video game development. I have a lot of coding experience, and then like you can find like assets online and whatnot, but at the end of the day, you're just gonna need to have your own assets. You're gonna need to retopologize them, break them yourself because whatever like vision you have, the chance of someone else having that exact vision and making an asset for it is very slim. So I was like, well, I might as well get better at modeling if I actually want to finish the game.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's a time and a place like for downloading models because it's just faster. And like sometimes if you want to make a whole scene or like a whole image, it's like you want to get it done. And sometimes that just takes like downloading stuff.
Yeah.
But sometimes I find it's like I spend so much time finding the right model and then bringing it into the scene, optimizing it, like fixing the topology or like making it look the way I want. That's like it would have been faster if I just made it myself from the beginning.
But would it though?
Sometimes it depends on what it is. I'm not really, it sounds like you guys are doing a lot of character work with characters. Like for me, who is not really into them, I'm just like, I'm gonna download that or and like just move some vertices around to make it look the way I want.
Yeah, that's what I did at first. I don't know. I started out with like a model from like Adobe, whatever. I made my own model, and I was like, this isn't good enough, and I just downloaded
Mm.
it. I don't really like that model. It doesn't look. It's not my vision. So eventually gonna have to just, make one and make it exactly how I want.
Yeah. And I think it's good to know the basics of like how things work um in general. So yeah, I think UC Bug was like super helpful for that.
Yeah, yeah, it's been really good.
I mean, do you guys want me to like pull up some of your like current work to show?
I'm
Or-
wishing you guys luck, especially with the 8 minute animatic. I would maybe recommend scoping down if you can. But I mean, the story I think is pretty strong. I was able to understand it, I think, just from watching that. But maybe instead, if you don't want to like scope down on time, that does mean like having a really minimalistic environment, which I think can work for the theme that you guys have. But yeah, good luck, and hopefully I can see it at the end of the semester.
48 minutes for you. Get some popcorn.
No, don't make it any longer. My only recommendation.
All right. Thank you so much for coming over.
Yep. Thank you.
Uh,
Bye.
Bye.